Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both in person and online attendees. And it's very nice to see what by post-COVID standards is kind of quite a full house. It's terrific, and our speaker deserves nothing less. I'm Professor Tony Sporforth, and I'm the chair. Even I was about to say DJ, I don't know what came into my head. I would like to start, before introducing our speaker, by thanking Flora Nicolaki from the London office of the British School, who has produced this absolute, well, we'll see, fail-safe document to get us through the event. But there's an important thing which needs to be said right at the beginning, which is to invite donations. Now, this is a lecture in the programme of the Friends of the British School at Athens, and the Friends, they support the school by organising regular lectures like this one, and also trips to Greece, which some of you here have been on. And you can help us by making a donation via our website donation portal, and the link is provided in the chat box for online attendees. And what you do, it says here, is you quote Friends' lecture in the additional comments field. And joking aside, these contributions and gifts, they do make a huge difference, and we all know about the hard times that we're in. Well, actually, I've got to ventriloquize a bit more before I see an excellent document, because there are a few, they're called protocols, apparently, and these are designed not by me, but by Flora, to help the online element of this event run smoothly. So throughout the talk, a Q&A feature is available. It looks like two speech bubbles, one on top of the other, into which you can type questions for the speaker. And only you, the speaker, and the host can see these, in case you're worried. After the lecture finishes, I will read out a selection of questions received online and in the room, and our speaker will respond. And in fact, it's Flora, really, who chairs the Q&A, and I will go and sit next to her, and she will keep me on the straight and narrow. I hope all that is clear. The Q&A protocol will be repeated at the end of the lecture. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Paul Halstead, gentleman here, who is Emeritus Professor of Archaeology at Sheffield University. And before Paul went to Sheffield, he was at Cambridge as both an undergraduate and a postgraduate, and as a postgrad in 1974, he joined the British School at Athens and spent several years as part of the British School community. And those who remember him from those days will know what a pillar of that community he was in all sorts of varied ways, which would justify a short talk in themselves. But apart from that, Paul is well known to many as a person who has conducted game-changing research on Aegean farming and land use, both ancient and modern. And ever since the 70s, Paul has remained close both to the school and, of course, to Greece. And Paul, if I may say, see if I can make him blush, is a born educator. And really from the 1970s onwards, he has been educating us all in how to think, and as importantly, how not to think about Mediterranean farming, ancient and, as I said, modern. And he's done this through conversation, through teaching and lectures, and by means of a stream of distinguished publications which continue to this day, and may that long be the case. And he's going to put us right tonight about olive production in archaic Athens and Attica. And I know that everyone is as impatient as I am to hear what he has to say. So I'm going to now hand over to Paul. Welcome.
So you're probably wondering how much I had to pay Tony for that leading introduction. He's assured me that all profits will be going to the British schools and that we pocket only a small fraction of the sum I paid him. So I don't know to what extent I'm going to be educating you about the importance of olive growing. I am not an ancient historian, and I think I should tread with trepidation into that field. And so I'm really going to be focusing more on what one can learn from what I've called citizen science, as I hope will become clear. So that's the title. I've chosen a suitably olive green. Well, it's a bit light for olive green, maybe, a greenish background on the subject. So, firstly, just the context. Why worry about how much people grew olives and exported oil in the ancient Mediterranean? And as some of you at least will know, the studies of the ancient economy of archaic and classical Greece has for many, many decades seen a conflict between two alternative schools of thought, between so-called primitivists who think that ancient Greece was largely a land of local self-sufficiency, and between so-called modernists who've tended to argue that trade between cities over long distances was actually a very important part of the ancient economy. And as to the role of the olive in this, then it's long been thought that long distance trade in olive oil may have played an important part in the ancient economy, and not least because of the fact that amphorae, such as carried at least some of the time olive oil, like these SOS amphorae, one of them here, were found widely across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So they're obviously, that makes oil a tempting candidate for a major export commodity. But I picked out two recent compendia on the ancient Greek economy. So Sitter von Reden in 2009 said that as regards the exchanges of olive oil that we're picking up through the amphorae, that these might be regular or they might be sporadic. So, you know, she's obviously seeing quite a lot of room for disagreement there. And likewise, in another recent compendium, Davies has argued that many regions of Greece would have produced a surplus of olives and grapes. And yet in the same volume, Muller's sort of take on surplus production of olives and grapes was perhaps. So, you know, there's obviously some room for disagreement there. And that's the sort of context into which I thought I'd launch myself. I should explain my contribution, my in inverted commas, comes from talking to elderly farmers. This is obviously something that I'm not the only person who does this. Someone who's done an awful lot of it in Greece in recent decades with a particular focus on olives is Hamish Forbes, previously of Liverpool, then Nottingham universities. And of course, it goes back much further to most famously, perhaps, the volume written by Wace and Thompson at the beginning of the 20th century, Flax of Pindos, the nomads of the Balkans. This is a picture of me being given a lesson in olive growing and grafting by a man in Messenia. So, as an outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to firstly start off by looking at what I will call a very modernist view of the issue. That is represented by Maurice Silver, who wrote an article in 2010. You can see the title, "The Role of International Trade in the Transformation of Attica's Agricultural Organization," from Socrates. And he draws principally on two lines of evidence. One is this distribution in space of containers for oil transport that I've already talked about. And the other line of argument that he draws on is two laws which have been attributed to Solon. And then I'll look at what I've labelled as a moderate primitivist view, the work of Lynn Foxall in her book, Olive Cultivation in Ancient Greece. And she focuses in particular on the evidence of the processing equipment for crushing and pressing olives. So a very, very different line of argument from trying to use ancient literary texts. And then I will use my citizen scientists to try and shed some light on the arguments that arise from these two authors. So I'll start with Silver. He's the modernist who thinks that trade in large volumes is a major component of the ancient economy. And start with the first of his lines of evidence, the amphorae. And he makes the point that the numbers of amphorae, which we find, amphorae that come from Greece, that we find around the Mediterranean and Black Sea, increases quite strongly during the 8th to 6th centuries BC. Now, one should qualify this observation by just taking note of the fact that not all of these amphorae started out in Athens or even Attica. Some did not carry oil, and many of them have been found in Attica. So no, not all of this is a very simple line of evidence for long-distance trade in oil. And to take the most famous of these amphora types, the one I've shown a picture of already, the SOS amphorae, from a recent study by Pratt, 2015, which I think was in the annual of the British School, if my memory doesn't fail me there. And so she documents the fact that we have about 10 of these amphorae scattered around the Mediterranean and Black Sea per year during the period in which SOS amphorae were being made and used. And that would add up to about 400 litres of oil. So the first thing we have to accept is that a map like this that looks terribly impressive may mean no more than, in terms of quantity of oil that is moving around the Mediterranean, no more than would be consumed by a handful of families in Greece today. Now, obviously, not all of the amphorae that were moving around the Mediterranean got discarded in places where we might find them. Not all of them have been dug up. By no means all of the ones that have been dug up have been reported in print. So this will be an underestimate of the total numbers of amphorae going around the Mediterranean. But it's extremely difficult to know what fraction of the original total it was, depending on the assumptions you make about the recovery rate and the publication rate. You might either decide that it's an impressively large number or that it's a rather disappointingly trivial number. And what that means in effect, as von Reyden was saying, is that ultimately this evidence is potentially compatible either with occasional gifts to important people around the Mediterranean or with quite intensive, regular commercial trade. So far, that's one line of evidence which I'm going to argue at present doesn't get us very far. And what I'm going to focus on more is the second line of evidence that that Silver cites, and that's that relating to two laws that have been attributed to Solon. So they've been attributed to the late Archaic period. Now, I should mention a disclaimer first, which is that we know about these laws from Plutarch's Life of Solon, written 600 or 700 years later. So to what extent these laws really were written down by Solon originally is a much debated issue. And there's also some debate about the content of the laws. I'm going to ignore all of that, as it's discussed at great length by people who know vastly more about it than I do. And I'm going to focus instead on, how we might interpret the laws if we just accept, for the sake of argument, that they date to when they are supposed to, and that they said what they're supposed to say. So the first of these laws is the one that, in translation, says, of the products of the soil, he being Solon, allowed oil only to be sold abroad. And so Silver then reads this as Solon encouraging an export trade in oil, and perhaps also in wine, he says, because maybe he meant food crops in general, not just olive oil. Whereas Peter Garnsey has suggested that we might read this rather differently as an attempt to ban speculative export of grain from Attica. So these are two rather different readings of that law. I'll come back to them later. The other law is one that governs where you're allowed to plant olive and fig trees. And this law says that you can't plant them within 9 feet of a neighbour's field. There's a very similar law in place today, which the purpose of the modern law, and doubtless of the ancient law, is to stop you planting a tree so close to the edge of your field that it shades out and takes all the water from the crops of your neighbour. So there's a good reason for having this law. Now, Silver interprets this as meaning that if you've got a law saying how close to the edge of a field you can plant olives, surely that means that the middle of the field is already full of trees. And on the basis of that, he concludes that Attica is under wall-to-wall olive trees, and therefore that they are growing olives on a very large scale. They're producing olive oil for export on a very large scale. And also that because they're growing olives on such a large scale, this will be at the expense of cereal growing. So we must also imagine a very large scale import trade in grain to Attica. And of course, this would mean that if you've got a very large scale export trade in olive oil and import trade in grain, that you can make a pretty strong case that the archaic and classical economy was indeed very, very commercially trade driven. And I'm going to, in a few moments, look at what citizen scientists have to say about this in tackling these two laws in reverse order. But firstly, we'll switch to what I've called the primitivist, the moderate primitivist perspective. That is that of Lynn Foxall, and I'm drawing here on her book and also on an article from 1993. And she focuses on what we know of the crushing and pressing equipment that you need to make olive oil. And she makes the point that dated equipment of this sort from Greece is extremely rare for the Archaic period. It's sparse for the classical and early Hellenistic periods, but then becomes dramatically more common in the Roman and late antique periods, and especially on rural survey projects. So, for example, from 4 or 5 survey projects that she tabulated in her book, I think the total of rural presses was something like 14 for the classical and Hellenistic period and 41 for the Roman and late antique. And this is the sort of thing that people are finding in the fields, that that would meet this category of evidence, the sort of stone equipment for pressing or crushing olives. Now, her interpretation of this changing pattern through time is that, since we know that they were growing olives in the Archaic and Classical periods, and were using olive oil, then, it's not that we imagine they weren't crushing and pressing olives, but that they must be doing it in a way that we can't see archaeologically, we don't see very clearly archaeologically. And she argues that the most likely way of understanding that is that they were using non-specialist equipment. So the sort of things that, might be made of wood, for example. So here's what's labeled in the Bernacchi Museum as an olive pressing, piece of olive pressing equipment. Okay, this is quite specialized in its manufacture, but it's very small scale, and it's of wood and obviously wouldn't survive archaeologically. And as an example of the sorts of ways in which you could use unrecognizable technology for these sort of tasks, here's a man in Hora in Messenia who's deciding to press his grapes. He's just spread a plastic sheet into something that holds up the sides, no nice built stone treading floor of the sort that one would love to find. So Lynn's argument is that probably in the Archaic and Classical periods, they're using sort of relatively low-tech, multi-purpose pieces of equipment that either don't survive or are not recognizable as olive pressing and crushing equipment. And she points out that if we look at the Attic stelae, these inscriptions which deal with the sale of the property of certain wealthy persons who got in trouble with the authorities in Athens, the same picture emerges from those sale descriptions of non-specialized equipment. So the conclusion from that is that even big landowners like the guys on the Attic stelae were not using very specialized equipment, probably pressing olives and growing olives on a modest scale. So we've got two quite different perspectives on the scale of olive growing there. Now, this is where my citizen scientists come in. I've spoken to a lot of elderly small-scale farmers in the south of Greece, and what they repeatedly tell me is that when they first started planting olives, they would routinely plant them on the edges of fields. And likewise, that's what their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers had done. And you do that because by planting them on the edges, as I've already said, they cast their shade in places where it doesn't do any harm. So this very ancient olive in Messenia is casting half of its shade on the road where it's not causing damage to anybody. Or when you plant them on terraces, you often plant them right on the lip of the terrace, often pointing outwards so that they shade the terrace wall. So here's my daughter acting as a scale. The yellow lines are meant to highlight the drop of the terrace. This one's on Kythera. You can see that the olives are being planted here right on the slope of the terrace, leaving it, the flat bit, free. And the same thing's going on there in those terraces in Crete. And this pattern that the elderly farmers are describing is something that it's quite easy to document by just wandering around the landscape. You can see they're not making this up. So here's a picture of a bit of the Peloponnese, fairly typical view where you can see wall-to-wall olives with the occasional block of vines in the middle. Once you start walking around that, you find that, so this is a picture of Jack Davis's at the location, or the place that was called Osmanaga until recently in Messenia. Look at these massive old olives here on the edge of this field, much, much thinner trunks in the middle. Same thing here from one of my ex-students from his own olives in near ancient Olympia. So one or two quite big ones in the field, but lots of infilling with things that have been planted in the last few years. This is one from Kythera, nice old olive here. I think that's over 100 years old from oral history rather than from me being able to tell from looking at it. Another old one behind it, third old one there, but then filling in the middle of the field, much, much younger trees. You see that everywhere you go in the south of Greece. So evidently, planting trees on the edges of fields doesn't necessarily mean that the middle is already full of trees, because it actually meant the reverse in the recent past. So that particular law of Solon's does not mean what Maurice Silver interprets it as meaning. And the reason recent farmers planted on the edges was to leave the middle of the field free for growing cereals. And where you do see old trees in the middle of fields, which is not that common, they tend to be far apart so that you could still grow cereals in between them. And they often have a much higher canopy than the modern fields. So they have a high canopy so you can drive your ox pair underneath, whereas today they have a low canopy, which makes it easier to pick the olives. And where you do have olives, either on narrow terraces or filling up fields, it's quite commonplace in the south of Greece for people preferentially to sow things like beans or fodder pulses underneath, because in that case, it doesn't matter to you that the shade is making the crop ripen unevenly. So if a cereal crop was ripening unevenly, that would be a real nightmare for harvesting. But if you're going to harvest the crop green for hay, you're not bothered if some of it's a bit riper than other bits. And if it's, in this case, broad beans that you're going to go in and pick as they become ripe, again, you're not too bothered if some parts of the field ripen ahead of others. So the priority is for growing dry grains in the middle of the fields in the recent past. And so next question is why? Well, the first obvious point we have to take on board here is what was the diet like of our informants in the early to mid 20th century. And as they describe it, it's very, very similar to what emerges from literary sources for classical Greece. The staple item is bread. That's where people get most of their calories from. And it's accompanied by various things that make bread a bit less boring to eat, like cheese, olives, oil, wine, grapes, wild greens, and so on. The same sort of thing happens in classical antiquity, opsons, in Foxhall was stressed. Now, because grain is the staple, it has an interesting characteristic, which is that demand for grain is much less elastic than it is for the things you eat with grain to make your bread tolerable. So what that means is that in a good year, the price of grain plummets, because once you've got enough grain to eat bread several times a day, quite frankly, you're not really interested in having any more. So the price collapses in a good year, but it rises steeply in a bad year. And just to give you an idea of how bad it can be, that's a picture from Naxos in 1990, but I could have taken it in Attica or in the Argolid that year. The drought was so bad that in this particular case, there's a barley field. Simply, there's nothing to harvest, so they've just let the cows in to eat it. Now, there's a big difference between large and small landowners in the impact of these fluctuations in prices. So if you're a large landowner, and the same happens today, you store the surplus from your good years, you just keep it back so that you can sell it next time there's a bad year when the price has gone up dramatically. That way you make a killing. And that's probably how a lot of the wealthy of classical Greece, and indeed some of those of the recent past, got wealthy. And that's also probably why there's so much in the epigraphical and literary evidence from classical Greece regarding the sorts of constraints on the wealthy for exporting grain during times of shortage or from raising prices extortionately. Conversely, if you're a small landowner, then in a good year, you're probably still going to end up selling your surplus because you're going to need it to buy shoes for the wife, doctor's appointments for your mother, buy coffee because it's one of those sort of minimum requirements of being civilized. And that means that you sell your surplus off at the time which is the worst time to sell it off, when the prices are very, very low. And then a bad year comes along and you're buying grain back from the big farmers at extortionate prices. So if you're a small scale farmer, these fluctuations in prices can be absolutely crippling. So there's a huge incentive to try and ensure that you don't end up having to buy grain in a bad year. This is slightly gratuitous. It's just an example of the sorts of huge grain baskets that people might have been storing surplus in. This one's from Larissa Museum. It would be sealed with a kind of dung plaster at the top to stop air getting in, which means that it will sort of sprout a little bit. Carbon dioxide will be given off, and that means the grain won't spoil and can be kept for quite a number of years until there's a bad year and you can make a killing. Now I'll switch to olives, and here I'll tell a little story about one of our favourite informants, sadly no longer with us. So Baba Elias was from the hills of Messenia. In the mid-19th century, his grandfather stole at night 2 olive cuttings from some of those big trees down on the coastal plain of Messenia. Probably, it sounded like they were probably from Osman Aga. And he grafted them back up in the hills onto wild rootstock. So that way he created his first 2 olive trees. And within a few years, they were starting to yield. And initially, they were just using them to make a little bit of oil for the family salad. And at that stage, they were crushing the olives on this. It was a flat boulder in their courtyard that they kind of flattened off a bit more, and they rolled this thing backwards and forwards on it. So he was told all this by his grandfather. So that was being used around about 1866 by his reckoning. But within a few years, they'd sort of grafted a few more trees. They were starting to be able to sell a bit of oil. So they were making some cash. They bought some more land. They grafted more trees, and they were away. And of course, all of this time, being sensible, frugal hill farmers, they were growing their own grain to ensure they were self-sufficient. So they acquired this crushing stone in 1868 that's kind of built into the wall of his barn. And then in 1927, this thing here. So rather more sophisticated crushing equipment than they started out with. So this is kind of nicely illustrating the points that Lynn Foxall was making in her book about the relationship between type of grinding and crushing equipment and scale of production. Now, the thing about olives is that they would normally produce a harvest once every 2 years, which means they're already a little bit less convenient than field crops that might produce a harvest every year. And if you have a hailstorm or a serious drought, then if that coincides with the good year, the on year, you may end up not getting a crop for more than once every 3 or 4 years. So here's an example from 2023, and my ex-student took a picture of his olive orchard after a hailstorm in September. So you can see he's lost a huge amount of the crop. Oh, that's a close-up. So olives are a little bit risky because you might have to wait a few years in between harvests. And every now and again, you get something more serious, That was me for a minute.
No, I was trying to turn it off.
You get something more serious like forest fires that ravaged the Peloponnese just a few years ago. Or in 1987, there was a very, very severe frost in May, which devastated the olives on Mount Pelion, across Evia, much of central Greece. And this is the sort of thing they were then forced to do. You cut back all the frost-bitten bits of the tree. And as you can imagine, it's going to be a good 10 or 20 years before that tree is properly producing. And even without such inconveniences, such disasters, although olives not being a staple, have a relatively stable price compared to grain. During World War II, when grain became very, very scarce in Greece, the price of grain rocketed sky high, what olive growers in many areas were finding, and likewise with the shepherds in Crete with their cheese, they were finding that the price of oil and cheese was not keeping pace with the rising price of grain. So that, you couldn't buy as much grain with your cheese or your oil as you used to be. And I've encountered farmers both on Kythera and in the Marne who've told me that during World War II, they actually chopped their olives down so that they could sow grain. So grain is the pathway to dietary security. So in the early 20th century then, it was very risky for small-scale farmers to specialize in olive growing. And from the point of view of large-scale farmers, it wasn't risky, but it would have been a lost opportunity to profiteer from windfall profits on grain in bad years. But from the 1970s onwards, especially from the 1970s onwards, we see a huge expansion of continuous wall-to-wall olive groves across southern Greece. And at the same time, cereal growing was widely abandoned. And of course, this is all happening in the context of regional specialization by small-scale farmers in growing olives or vines or whatever, and in the wider context of very large-scale exchange of agricultural products, both between different regions of Greece and between Greece and other parts of Europe and neighboring regions. So what might this tell us about the plausibility of specialization in olive growing in the Archaic and Classical period? Inconveniently, if we accept a kind of modernist, trade-dominated vision of the ancient economy, then it might well have been viable to specialize in olives. And if we follow what I think is Lynn Foxall's position, if we want to be a primitivist and emphasize local self-sufficiency, then it wouldn't be viable. Of course, the problem here is we're going straight back to the wider question about the ancient Greek economy that Silva was trying to answer by looking at Solon's laws. We can look a little bit further at this by looking at archival evidence for specialization in olive growing in southern Greece in the 16th and 19th centuries. So during the 16th to 18th centuries, the Venetians widely encouraged the growing of olives and grapes in various regions for export. So this was a maritime empire. They were basically encouraging people to grow the things they wanted to remove back to Venice. And we know, for example, from written sources that in the southern Argolid and on East Crete, the encouragement to grow more olives resulted in olive groves. And I'm sure this is the case elsewhere, but you've got to be lucky to have the right sort of written information. Olive groves rather than scattered trees. On Kythera, where the Venetians were also encouraging the growing of olives, we know that this primarily bore fruit, if you'll excuse the pun, on the land of nobles, people with a lot of land. So the rich people with lots of land were quite keen on responding to the encouragement to grow olives. and did so. The smallholders thought, this looks risky. What happens if there's a famine and I've got no grain? They were, by and large, didn't follow this advice. And then from the Ottoman agricultural census of Messenia in 1716, we know that olives were particularly concentrated at the biggest Ottoman estate at Osman Agha. And this is where, as I've already shown you some pictures from autopsy today, you can see that many of the olives that would have been growing at the time around on that estate were concentrated on the field edges, even though we're looking at a very, very large landowner. Really nice example is the work of Hamish Forbes in the Southern Argolid, where he points out that in the 19th century, the local ship owners started planting olives in order to have a return cargo when they'd come from the Black Sea, perhaps with shiploads of grain to distribute around the Mediterranean. Then they didn't want to go back empty, so they grew olives, so they got oil to take back. So we see then that there's quite a lot of evidence for top-down encouragement of large-scale growing of olives, including continuous olive groves, but it's mainly on the estates of the wealthy or in places with particularly good access to overseas export markets and to homegrown or imported grain, should your own limited grain supply fail. So to come back to the question that I started out with, did they specialize in olive growing in the archaic classical Greece? I'm really not the right person to answer this, but I would say that for small landowners, this might be a viable strategy if they could be confident that there'd be no forest fires, no late frosts, no wars, no interruptions through bad weather or hostile activity to grain imports, which I think basically means I don't believe it could have been viable. In the case of large landowners, it would have been viable to do this. It's still possible on a small fraction of your fields to grow enough grain to maintain self-sufficiency. But if these people were doing it with growing olives on a large scale, then they would almost certainly need specialist crushing and pressing equipment. And that means the kind of equipment that would be durable, we'd find it, and that would be recognizable. So it would be in Lynn Foxhall's tables. She also points out that there's only one textual reference to a grove of olives as opposed to scattered trees. So I suspect that large landowners in archaic and classical Greece preferred to profiteer from grain, which, as I've said already, would match the extent to which literary and epigraphic sources are kind of exercised about what wealthy landowners do with their grain surpluses. Now, in the late Hellenistic and in Roman Greece, Foxhall points out you've got more crushing and pressing equipment, but she also points out that you've got larger land holdings. So, even now, it must in principle be possible that there isn't any change in the amount of olive growing that's going on or the amount of olive exporting that's going on, but rather that because it's concentrated into fewer, bigger land holdings, you're more likely to have specialist equipment. As I said, I don't think I'm really the right person to answer the question I posed. What really interested me was, can we use the citizen scientists profitably in this sort of exercise to help us understand the arguments that are going on? And there are obviously pros and cons to this. This, I should say, is Barbara Elias, whose granddad stole 2 cuttings at night from trees down in lowland Messenia. So the first thing, obviously, the advantage is that elderly farmers got first-hand experience of most of the crops that were grown in antiquity. They have first-hand experience of a fairly similar physical environment and of a technology that in many cases was not dramatically different, although in some cases it was. Conversely, most historians and archaeologists come from towns like me, often from beyond the Mediterranean like me, which means that we are in most cases armchair farmers, and so we would do well to listen to what these old guys have to say to us. Of course, there are dangers in relying on these sources. And the most obvious one is that the early to mid 20th century was not the same as antiquity. It did differ in some respects. But equally, in fact, even more so, I would say that Maurice Silver, in extrapolating the principles of modern economics to try to reconstruct the ancient economy, is perhaps even more guilty than I am of using the recent past uncritically to understand the distant past. And I think extrapolating the experiences of these people is going to be safest if we can do so when it's free from human choices or decisions. And what I mean by that is that quite a lot of what I've talked about is contrasting the risks attached to growing annual grain crops versus growing long-lived tree crops. You know, just the very fact that some things you plant every year and others take 10, 20 years to mature means that the kind of risks involved are fundamentally different. I've assumed that ancient Greeks used grain as their staple dietary item, but firstly, I don't think there's any viable alternative. And secondly, that matches what the ancient literary sources tell us. But what obviously requires more caution is once we start interpreting the marginal planting of olive trees. You know, I've presented one way of reading that, Maurice Silver's presented another. And, you know, in both cases, we're looking at the logic behind people's decisions. You know, I've chosen to highlight people's risk avoidance. He's chosen to highlight their kind of profit maximization. You get to choose which you think is the more sensible strategy. Anyway, thank you for listening online and in the room. I have to say thank you to the elderly citizen scientists for sharing their expertise. Needless to say, I don't know how many of them are still alive, very few at best. And I should also thank Angelos, Jack and Valasier because I've used their photographs in this presentation. So, thank you very much.